La universidad es un lugar de innovación, por eso innovación y universidad son la misma cosa.
En Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, los estudiantes son los dueños de su proyecto académico.
We've developed incredible curriculum, we've developed incredible outreach.
Es la carrera del futuro de alguien que quiera adentrarse en el apasionante mundo de los estudios políticos con la libertad como eje central.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another conversation organized by the Institute for Political Studies and International Relations at the UFM. My name is Will Ogilvie, and I am the coordinator of global affairs at the faculty. And I was very interested in talking about Ukraine because it was all over the news in 2014, but then disappeared. And so I am very grateful to have our guest today. Very recently, two professors on foreign affairs put the matter neatly when reflecting over Ukraine. They said, over the past quarter of century, nearly all major efforts of establishing a durable post-Cold World War order on the Eurasian continent have founded on the shoals of Ukraine. For it is in Ukraine that the disconnect between the triumphalist end of history delusions and the ongoing realities of great power competition can be seen in its starkest form. I was talking with our guest a week ago, and we acknowledged that Ukraine had been, of course, all over the news in 2014, but it somehow dropped from the scene, and we would really want to know what was going on, so hence the motivation behind our conversation of today. It has long been known Ukraine as a country of great potential. However, it is still mostly unfulfilled due to a number of reasons, some of them stemming from the Soviet past, and some are rooted in the present. So we would like to invite you to joining us in this conversation in which we'll be exploring these issues and learning from them, hopefully, so other countries might avoid the same mistakes. That's basically the idea. Welcome, Natalie.
Hello.
Hello, Natalie. How are you doing?
I am great. What about you?
Very great. Very well here too. It's great to have you. And just to give a small bio about yourself for other people in the university who might not have known you yet, even though you were with Antigua Forum a couple of years ago. That was a very good coincidence. So you're not a stranger to the House of Freedom in Central America, which is good to know.
That's for sure. And I'm very happy to be there again, even though through technology this time and not in person. It was a lot more enjoyable last time because I got to enjoy summer in the middle of winter here in Ukraine. So yeah, if you want some snow, I can send it your way. It's right outside the window. So I am Nataliya, and I am the director of Bendukidze Free Market Center, which is a Ukrainian think tank with a proud Georgian name. And we mostly deal with policy recommendations, educational projects, and research, all to promote free market ideas, because we feel that a lot of the issues that we are dealing with in Ukraine right now, they could have been, omitted or, completely disposed of if we chose the path to a freer society, like a lot of post-Soviet countries actually did quite successfully.
That's amazing. I imagine the conversation, well, just before we get into the questions and the conversation that we're going to be having, I would just like to say to anyone who's watching that in more or less half an hour after we're done a bit in the conversation, we'll be looking at a lot of the questions and comments that everyone will be writing in YouTube or Facebook. And I'll be trying to ask Natalie some of those questions. I don't know if we'll be able to make it through most of them. Normally we can't because we have quite a live audience who likes to comment and ask questions, but we'll be trying to get into that in the last 20 minutes of the session. So everyone just feel free to comment and to ask any of the questions. We'll be getting to them at the end of the session. So Natalie, maybe to kick things off, I would like to Well, give you the chance, because there's many ways in which one can start to present the situation, because of course Ukraine is a country with a very rich past, but maybe what background would you like to give us before we get into the conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I will be addressing the topic of today's discussion under the assumption that people I'm talking to do not know that much about Ukraine, about its rich and very long history with a lot of wars and revolutions. If there is one thing that you take out of this conversation, out of this discussion, that will make me feel extremely happy and satisfied with how everything went, is that you learn that it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine, which is extremely important for us, because the Ukraine refers to Ukraine being a part of a different country. So it ticks the wrong box for us, and that the capital city of Ukraine is Kyiv, not Kiev, which is the Russian way of presenting it. But of course, I'm joking, even though if you learn that, really, you will make my day. And on a more serious note, a lot in Ukraine's history has stemmed from its location. So it is basically situated in a geographical center of Europe, and on the borderline of powerful empires, which is usually a bad thing, because, like the quote you mentioned right at the very beginning, it means that we're in the middle of a power struggle. And it was true centuries ago, and it is true right now. And I think it's very important to understand this aspect and its influence on the situation in the country and in the region itself. And the region is Eastern Europe, and it's quite not stable for these reasons. And I will address this issue hopefully more in detail in a bit. So basically, throughout its history, Ukraine was divided between a number of countries, and it developed under the influence of two different civilizations. So if for one side we have Austrian Empire, and on the other we have the Russian Empire. So the Austrian Empire influence was obviously more westernized, and it had about control over about 15% of Ukraine's ethnic territories, while the Russian Empire had control over about 85%. Mm-hmm. And these different civilizations, these different cultures and different religions, they caused the situation in which sometimes we would have the politicians or the media addressing the situation of two different Ukraines, or the division of Ukraine into two parts, because we have Western Ukraine, which is closer to Europe, to the European tradition, and with the religion being Catholic, and the rest of Ukraine, which is central, eastern, northern, and southern, being under the influence or closer to the Russian traditions, Russian culture, Russian language, and the Orthodox Church. And that's why, throughout these years, throughout centuries, we had to struggle with our identity, and we've had to go through numerous wars and revolutions to fight for the independence, which we finally got in 1991.
Okay. After this general picture, which I think is a brilliant way to introduce someone who knows nothing, and I always like having conversations and framing them as if people knew nothing about a topic, because this way you really make sure that people understand. What relevant sort of What would you say that's more relevant in the 20th century that helps explain what then happened after 1991, of course?
Well, once again, we're talking about the baggage. Let's forget about the Roman Empire, right? The Austrian Empire. We had another empire to deal with, and it was the Soviet Union. And within the Soviet Union, we still had this division, because you might assume that Ukraine, being the former Soviet Republic, right, it was a united country, even though it was part of a different one. There was an important historical fact that you need to understand, that most of the territory really was part of the Soviet Union, starting from 1918, right, and all the way until 1991. But the Western territories, the pro-European ones, they joined, well, rather than they were joined into the Soviet Union way later, in 1939, when Poland was split between the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany. So prior to that, these territories were part of Poland. So this longevity of European tradition, it continued. And then once again, this division, this civilizational discourse, it came back again and again, even after Ukraine became independent. So our history shows that about once in 10 years, we have a major revolution in the country. And usually it has something to do with the way in which the country wants to move forward. So either we choose the European way or we choose the Russian way. And until the latest revolution in 2013-14, this was fair, right? But afterwards, we started looking for a different option, right? Because maybe we want to come up with our own way, which, I don't know, by some miracle we'll be able to unite these opponents of different versions. Because if we continue thinking about it like this, we will never have a united country, and we will never be able to resolve all of these issues that ultimately led to us being at war with Russia for the past couple of years.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I wanted to get a bit into the Soviet past of the country, which I think is super important to explain what you're going through today. But I would like to get some input also, if we move forward time a bit and we get into after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how was that handled, and in what way would you say differently from other more successful countries, as you were saying at the beginning?
Yeah, so when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a huge window of opportunity to, say goodbye to your past and just move forward, move on, and towards a better life, obviously. And those countries who were able to do that, they had to go through an extremely painful process of introducing pro-market reforms. And the first country to do that, it was Estonia. Even though they had to go through first couple of horrible years with virtually no money, and with the whole country suffering greatly. But now Estonia, and then later Lithuania and Latvia, they comprise the group of successful post-Soviet countries. So they are high-income countries. They are technologically advanced. They are free countries when we take a step outside of the democracy scope, when we're talking about economic freedom and the whole environment, which pushes people or encourages people to try to realize their potential and go with their private initiative compared to just relying on the state. So these are the successful cases. And then we have moderately successful cases, which would be Poland, for example, Georgia. So Poland got its push when they joined the European Union in 2004. So it certainly helped a lot, both economically and politically. But right now, Poland is not as stable as before. As for Georgia, they also implemented wonderful reforms under Mikhail Saakashvili and Kacha Bandukidze, whose name my organization carries. And but they are still going through political turmoil just because they are way closely connected to Russia than the first countries I listed. And Russia meddles into Georgian affairs quite actively. Maybe you heard there was a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. And some of the territories are still not under full Georgian control. They are so-called national republics, which exist only because of Russia's support. So when we move down to the less successful countries, we see more problems coming from political instability and economic instability that goes with it. And then we move a bit lower towards Russia, then Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine. Why we do that? Because these countries have lower incomes. Ukraine and Moldova are considered the poorest countries in Europe. We have less economic freedom, so more things are regulated by the state. We are more dependent on the state. Just think about this. Basically, every third Ukrainian works for the state in some way, which is huge. Ukraine is a huge country. We have a lot of state enterprises, only about 20% of which are profitable. So we also have a huge welfare state, which is basically tying people to state support, subsidies, and so on. And when there is no money in the budget, you can't really be supporting people that well. So we are a welfare state with no welfare. When we're talking about these problems, we need to understand that what we should be targeting is a cultural change. Cultural change in the way people are thinking, people are planning their lives and planning their future, and how much responsibility they are willing to take on themselves, right? Because if you have a country in which the government decides what you get to do, how you get to do it, and so on and so forth, you lose your freedom, but you also don't have to be responsible for anything, right? And which might be convenient for some, right? But we want to move away from that. We want to put more faith and trust into people, that they will be able to decide what's better for themselves and what kind of future they want to have. And I'm proud to say that that's something that my organization is trying to do in Ukraine. And hopefully, cultural changes, they don't come easy and they take time. And hopefully we will see this switch and we will be able to join Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and leave all the lagging losers behind.
Yes, most hopefully. But one, you're talking about culture, and culture is always like a slippery issue, isn't it? Because not just the definitions are complicated, but how to create cultural change is a fascinating topic. Can it be done top down? Of course, that's another interesting question. But if we're thinking about the 90s, for example, and you've talked about more successful ex-Soviet countries, how were they able to do it? I mean, do you think there was a very big difference, cultural difference before the Soviet Union fell, and that was what more or less propelled those countries into more freer nations in economically, politically, and all the other areas?
Well, I would like to say that those countries, they were smaller, they had shorter history of being within the Soviet Union, they were not as closely tied to the Soviet Union, and they were able to sever those ties quite quickly after the Soviet Union fell apart. While at the same time, let's move to Ukraine, and we see that we did not do that. We did not opt for pro-market reforms. We went more of a, let's say, populistic way, maybe because people were so excited that Ukraine is an independent country finally, that they kind of relaxed and, just let it go, stopped paying attention to what was actually happening. And so we became part of so-called Union of Sovereign States. So this is an international organization that unites some of the Soviet countries, and basically it was created to save this connection towards Russia, save this dependency on the international stage. And Ukraine left the Union of Sovereign States only in 2014. So only after the annexation of Crimea, only after the conflict turned into war, right? Georgia did it sooner. Georgia did it in 2009. Under the influence of their respective war with Russia. And so right now they have Armenia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Moldova, Belarus, Russia, obviously. So we were still hanging on onto our common past, and we always viewed Russia and Russians as our brother nation. So we were holding on to that, and we were extremely economically dependent on Russia. So most of our trading was going on with Russia, and we were also, usually in this situation, we used the term addicted to Russian gas, oil and gas, right, which is being transported through Ukraine still. And we just needed this huge push to finally look elsewhere. And we got this push in 2014. That's when we had to, change our trade policies. We had to find new trade partners. We needed to find other places where we could buy gas. And it was a miracle, but and many people believed that we would not be able to, that Russia would not let it happen. But we succeeded, and that's an important part of why we are still able to be at war with Russia. Because if we did not do that, even though it was too late, 100% we did it too late, but we still did it. It's too bad that the push we needed was war, which is still going on, unfortunately. And we don't know when it will actually stop, because we were dependent on the international community a lot. We were hopeful that we would have more of assistance or help from other countries, but this is something that comes with the territory. Ukraine is a buffer state between the European Union and Russia. And we learned it the hard way that European Union would not be looking into adding Ukraine into the Union, right? Because A, they don't want to have the border shared with Russia. B, Ukraine is a huge country with a lot of economic and political problems, including this, choice between, do we want to be part of the European Union, or do we want to be friends with Russia again? And we did not get the support from the international community, and we were probably being naive about it too, because basically Russia tested the waters, if I can say so, with their war with Georgia. Since the international community did not intervene, then it was a much smaller scale. They were just deeply concerned. And Russia could see, it's not fair to say Russia. The Russian government, ruled by Putin, they saw that they were permitted to act that way. And so they did the same thing in Ukraine. And once again, the international community was concerned, but nothing came out of it. So we were left alone with this problem, with basically no army in 2013, 2014. So we had to rebuild it, and our volunteers did it. So basically, it was all carried on the shoulders of the Ukrainian people themselves, sending money, provisions, and just volunteering to go to the army. But here we go into the international relations aspect from a different viewpoint. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine inherited, let's say, not only all of the Soviet problems, or most of them, but we also inherited a huge nuclear arsenal, which was the third biggest in the world, or about so. And we gave it up. In 1994, we agreed to give up the nuclear weapons, the technology to develop nuclear weapons, research and everything connected with it, and we signed the treaty, which is basically we became a non-nuclear weapon state. And since we signed the treaty, the non-proliferation treaty, with the UK, the US, and Russia also participating in the treaty, and that these countries take onto themselves the responsibility to protect Ukraine if something happens, right? So it was in 1994, and it did not protect us in any way. And I would say that in about 2014 was the year in which we regretted doing that back then, not in a serious way of considering reversing the decision, because obviously many years were lost. And if you think about it, you really don't want to be a nuclear weapon state so close to Russia, you know, and without being a stable country politically and economically. But we regretted basically handing our future into the hands of the international community, let's say that, which did nothing to protect us in 2014. And we don't even hope that they will do anything right now, because the treaty existed back then. It still exists right now. So there is a disappointment, there is bad aftertaste now. And but it doesn't explain why we let go of our army, why it was in shambles as it was. And it can't explain everything, the international relations, the situation in the region. We need to look into our own problems, and we need to try solving them on the political level. So if we don't have the political willingness to resolve these issues within the government, top down, we need to be looking into creating the momentum bottom up. So which we attempted with the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 2014, when the government announced that they would not be signing the association treaty with the European Union. That's how everything started. So the students, mostly students, started protesting all over Ukraine, but it really blew up when they got beaten up. So when you see the police beating up kids, what do you expect? Adults react, and they reacted like they did. We had a huge revolution, and the government retreated with the then acting president fleeing Ukraine. So we made our civilizational choice, but once again, it was half step, right? We didn't do the changes necessary to curb corruption. Most of the changes were on the surface, and we didn't get rid of most of the regulation, which funnily enough, still now in 2020, most of it was inherited from the Soviet Union. So how do you expect to be a successful modern country if you still have to rely on prescriptions, created by communists and for communist countries? So we're just a country which proves that half steps can be as detrimental as no steps at all.
We were talking in class a couple of days ago about non-proliferation treaties on nuclear weapons, and we were talking about Ukraine because no one really imagined 2014 happening if you still would have held on to those weapons, of course. And at the same time, who would want to risk a war with Russia to defend Crimea, for example, something like that? So it's a very, like, the international community is all about one thing, but the incentives are really strong for countries to have and develop nuclear weapons, like North Korea is an example now, because people are looking at Ukraine and saying, look, what happened in 2014 would have been unimaginable if they hadn't heeded the nuclear weapons, which is interesting.
Absolutely.
I would like to ask you, I want to ask you another question of the 90s, but I'm running out of time. And before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that we'll be looking at the questions on Facebook and YouTube. We already have a couple of them, but I'll be getting into that in 10-15 minutes. I'll just say that in Spanish, just in case. Vamos a estar respondiendo a las preguntas que tengáis, que estéis haciendo en Facebook y en YouTube como en 10 minutos. Así que adelante, ya tenemos algunas de ellas, pero las intentaremos entrar en esta parte de la sesión en 10 minutos. So, I agree with you in absolutely, I think, nearly everything that you've said, Natalie. Georgia was indeed the way the Russians, Putin, tested the waters, and one can really understand Ukraine after that. But let's get into what happened after 2014, because in a way, Russia's reaction can be a reply to Ukraine looking west, saying, no, we are not going to allow you to look that way because it's strategically too important to us. And I don't want to get too much into the geopolitics of it, but what has happened since 2014? What could you explain? What has happened in the last 6 years from the point of view of the Russian problem, of course, but also governmentally, what public policies are getting into? What's happened basically in the last 6 years? That'd be the question.
Well, so first of all, we had the elections, and the party, the president that won, he won on the platform that we are trying to distance ourselves from Russia, right? They are not the friend, they are the foe, right? And we should be looking into ending the war as soon as possible, which is obviously, not realistic, but that's something everyone wants to hear, right? Whether you support this president or you don't support this president, you don't want to be at war, especially if it's being at war with Russia, which invests, a lot of money and resources into its army, and for which having control in different parts of the world is extremely important to support their own political agenda, right? Because if you have a lot of problems happening in your country, it's nice to have a common enemy outside of your country. that you can use to distract your own people. We did that. That's why basically we left the Union of Sovereign States. That's why we went into closer trade relations with European countries, so on and so forth. But at the same time, you still have a certain percentage of people which is not happy with the situation. They think that what happened in 2013 and 2014 was unconstitutional, that we should be looking into ending the war through building or rebuilding our friendly relationship with Russia. And that was a big mistake, ignoring these people, because it doesn't make them go away, right? If you don't try to communicate with them, they are set in their own ways. And a lot of these people are living in the regions which are not controlled by Ukraine right now, because we have these little enclaves in the eastern Ukraine, in two oblasts, which is like a part of Ukraine, which are being controlled by Russia. And they are insurgents, right? We can call them insurgents. But at the same time, they wouldn't be able to drag this on for so many years if they didn't have the help of the Russian military. But for Ukrainians, it's like a joke when Russians keep repeating, "We are not there," about their presence in eastern Ukraine. So somehow the matter of Crimea is just somewhere far in the background, because we don't have any, active situation of war there. There was never fighting there. So now we still have diplomatic relations with Russia, because there is this. I don't know what would be the correct way of calling them, but it's basically the negotiations based in Minsk in Belarus, which are meant to bring peace, to end this war. So Belarus is part of it, Ukraine is part of it, Russia is part of it. So technically right now we officially are not at the state of war. We have a temporary peace that's happening, which should influence the use of heavy weaponry in the eastern Ukraine, but we still have the fighting hasn't ceased. The fighting isn't in the frozen stage, right? So it's still happening, and the fact that it's not in the media, it's just no big changes. It's just permanently happening. That's why there's no more attention, especially with what's happening in Azerbaijan and Armenia, or what was happening there. So the political mistake of not trying to change people's minds, not trying to address these issues and try to understand where they're coming from, right? Because for us, it was easier to say, well, they're just watching Russian TV, right? They're getting all their information from Russia. They have their families in Russia. That's why they're so closely tied with Russia. And if they don't like something in Ukraine, they should just pack their bags and move to Russia. That's what you can say in this situation. But it turned out to be the wrong strategy, because we just recently went through another election cycle. So we had a presidential election last year, we had a parliamentary election this year, and the former party, the former president, they completely lost, because you have this frustration stemming from dire economic situation, dire political situation, the war with Russia. So it's just adding extra stress on people, and that's how they reacted, not with the revolution this time, but through the elections. And we had a former comedian with a law degree who became the president of Ukraine. Yes, he was also talking about ending war with Russia. He tended to be let's say, less aggressive towards Russia with his words. So he had this popular appeal. And some of the people who voted for him, they were hoping that maybe he would be leaning closer to Russia. It's not possible in Ukraine to have a president who will openly come out and say, let's be friends with Russia once again, because it's political suicide. And he will have another revolution on his hands, which is more dangerous right now because we have more weapons. People are armed because all of those volunteers coming back from the war, all of those former and reserve army people, they're coming back with weapons. So if the revolution in 2013-14 was mostly peaceful, now it would not be peaceful at all. And it would be treated as treason, right? But he can still be playing with those sentiments. And he had close business ties with Russia. He still has business in Russia. And a lot of the people who were elected into the parliament, they are incredibly random people with no, diplomatic experience, with no political experience. And they created, for the first time in Ukrainian history, after the success of the presidential election, the president basically created his own party out of nowhere. That's why he had to invite random people into the party. And they absolutely won the parliamentary election. And for the first time in Ukrainian history, we had so-called mono majority. So when in the parliament, you have one party with the majority votes. So basically, their hands were untied because they could vote for anything and everything. They didn't need to negotiate with other parties at all. And we were actually extremely hopeful because we thought, well, since they have all the power, they could vote for all of these laws that they mentioned prior to the elections, which were great ideas, decreasing states' involvement into the economic affairs, a lot of them dealing with the security service in Ukraine, which is second in the world in manpower only to the FBI. And as you know, the FBI, they perform functions of federal police. While in Ukraine, security service does not have those functions, but it's still humongous. And why it's so huge is because it basically acts as oversight over any economic activity happening in the country. So they are monitoring it, they are raiding it, they're impeding it. So all of these things that the president and his party people mentioned that they would change, they didn't do. But we did have one major change, which is also part of an important step forward. We used to have land moratorium in Ukraine. Now, land moratorium, it meant that people were owners of agricultural land, but they were not allowed to sell it. So if they had no one to give the land to, no one to inherit that land, they just basically died with their property, and the property went to the state. And which is basically completely destroying the whole point and sense of property rights, right? If you don't have full control over your property. So they canceled that. They got rid of the land moratorium. They're still working on the details and everything, but it's a huge step. People will be able to do the things they want to do with their property, but it also moved us into the situation of constitutional crisis. So that's what we have right now, in which the Constitutional Court is just naming all of these decisions, major decisions, as anti-constitutional. So we are, at a situation in which all of these decisions, even the good ones that were voted through the parliament, they would be reversed. So just, a cherry on top of the cake. on top of the pandemic. We're not only dealing with the pandemic, with the war and the economic situation, we have a constitutional crisis on our hands as well.
Oof, I've got 1,000 questions, but I'm afraid I can't monopolize the microphone because I have a bunch of questions coming in from the internet. These are good questions too. So I'm going to start with, you can reply as long as you want to. It'll be great if we can get through some of them, but you'll be directing how you want to answer all of this. Okay, Natalie? So an interesting question through Facebook by Jose Alvarez. He's asking, how do you think cultural diversity is an opportunity for prosperity?
I'm all for cultural diversity, all for diversity of any kind. It is important for letting people, be who they want to be, and acknowledging the differences. And out of a culturally diverse environment, you have different points of view, you have different initiatives, different innovations. And as we know, innovations are the way, towards prosperity. Because to be a successful country right now, you need to create an environment in which people have an opportunity to fulfill their private initiative, right? And the more ideas we have, the better it is. But when we're talking about Ukraine, we do not have cultural diversity in Ukraine. Because you can't say that what you have, the majority is Ukrainian, and then the biggest minority is Russian, and this is not diversity, right? It's not enough to call it a culturally diverse state, because all of the other minorities that we do have, they're tiny. And being this small, unfortunately, I have to say it because I want to say it truthfully, they are irrelevant. Even though they're still culturally closer to, bigger groups, right? Either Russians or Ukrainians, because in Ukraine, what do we have? What kind of split we have? It's religious. Once again, it's Catholics and Orthodox, but they're still Christians, right? Languages, Ukrainian, Russian. They're still Slavic languages, and almost 100% of Ukrainian-speaking people understand Russian, even though it's more difficult for Russians to understand Ukrainian. So it's not enough to say that we have so many differences, that we are culturally diverse. No, we're not. And maybe that's part of our problem. Maybe that's why we feel this split so much, because we're talking about two big groups of people. And we wouldn't have that if we had smaller groups of people in play.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand what you mean, is that they're not politically relevant because they're too small and their vote wouldn't be counted. I know what you mean, but that's where I think liberalism comes in to help. There's many ways to look at it economically, but at least politically, it's the idea of diversity and tolerance for different ideas, different ways of approaching what a good society in the classical sense should be, and not resulting to violent means to achieve that, which is one of the things.
I must point out, though, that tolerance is becoming increasingly difficult in a society which is at war.
Oh yes, I wish it was. Well, I would hope that it was only in a society at war, but everyone's saying that polarization is everywhere. The word of this last couple of 5 years, but I can only imagine. Okay, there's another question through YouTube by Nacho Martin. And this is asking, well, he's saying, Ukraine suffers constant aggression from Russia. What do you think Biden's presidency will mean for Ukraine regarding this issue? I can only imagine that you're not going to be very optimistic, but please go ahead.
Well, with Donald Trump being so, let me say, enamored with Putin and just liking the whole idea of Putin as a political persona that he's showing off to the world, we were not thrilled with Donald Trump in the first place. So Joe Biden does not have that, but he is a career politician. And we need to understand, like, these are the things that we were talking about. The US comes first. And if you're choosing sides, right, or if you're planning your foreign policy, you need to understand that their interests come first, and then Ukrainian interests are somewhere far, far behind. Even though we are partners with the US, we have a decent relationship with the US, but it's also important to remember that we were actually trying to prosecute Joe Biden's son in Ukraine for corruption. So, it was, we were following the results of American elections closely. So we will see if Joe Biden holds a grudge, and actually that the criminal proceedings are still open in Ukraine. So yeah, we will have to look into that as well. When Russia is in play, Ukrainian interests will be more or less, far behind. So we will be judging by the actions. So I would say that there was no feeling of disappointment, or we were not afraid when it started looking like Joe Biden was going to win the American elections. But I think a lot of it is coming from the fact that we do have military assistance coming from the US, and we've had it coming from the US for a while now, and that's not going to stop, right? Because the US is not that type of a country which completely changes the foreign policy and the assistance programs based on who the president is. That's what comes with, being federal state and the whole decision-making process in the US. While in Ukraine, it can be a change maker. So we think that that's going to continue. And as for the relationship between Joe Biden and Putin, well, it will be different than between Donald Trump and Putin, but we are certainly not suddenly hoping that Joe Biden will come flying into Ukraine and just say, if Putin does not withdraw military support to those insurgents, so we will go to war with Russia. We've learned our lesson the hard way, and I think right now we are far less dependent on the international power play, or maybe hopeful of the international power play deciding everything in Ukraine. And this is probably the correct way, because this is our problem, right? This is the problem in the region. Of course, Russia is not going anywhere, and we should be responsible for our own future, and we should be looking into ways of resolving this problem without having to rely on anyone else.
Okay. As I'm running out of time, some of the other questions many of the other questions have one thing in common, which is the role of the European Union. Mm-hmm. And so even though there's some differences from question to question, I think they all have in common, what sort of picture can you give us of the will among the Ukrainian citizens to converge towards the EU? Mm-hmm. Would 2030 be a realistic milestone for example? Sort of what's happened? We know that the tension of 2014, like you were saying at the beginning, and that tension between going east or west was one of the main sparks that ignited this war. But how is that today? Is basically the question.
Well, there has been a huge change, because not only because more people in Ukraine started looking towards the European direction, but when we're saying European, it does not necessarily mean the EU, because objectively, Ukraine will not be a member state. But let's say pro-Western, right? More people are pro-Western, that's true. But in 2013, 14, maybe 2015, our mistake, the mistake of Ukrainian people, was thinking that if we get closer to the European Union, or we were still hopeful, of becoming a member state, it would resolve all of our problems. Because we saw the positive impact on Poland when they joined in 2004. But this is, being naive, right? If you become the member state, it doesn't matter that your corruption just goes away, and all of the other problems with rule of law, right? One of the biggest problems in the post-Soviet countries is the disrespect or absence of rule of law. And because of that, we have disrespect of property rights, and which are not protected, and the agreements are not enforced, and everything like that. So these things, they don't just get solved if you sign the association agreement, which we did, right, in 2014. The problems didn't go away, and that's why I mentioned this, looking to find the third way forward, right? Because the EU is not our savior, should not be our savior, and can't become our savior. And this is a healthy way of looking into it. Partnership with the EU is extremely important, because we have close trade relations, so we should be, building on those trade relations. But we should also understand that the EU is in crisis as well. The EU has their own problems to deal with. A lot of them are surrounding Brexit. A lot of them are just laying heavily on the shoulders of Germany, that has to support a lot of the worse doing countries in the European Union. And they have immigration crisis as well. So they have a lot of their own issues. And civilizationally, I would say that most Ukrainians are looking into the Western line of development and just building the country, looking forward. But once again, it doesn't mean that it's like 80%. It's not, right? It's not even 70%, right? We should be probably talking about around 60%. And if it is 60%, so 40%, it's still a lot of people. And these are still people who have close ties with Russia and close family ties with Russia. And it doesn't mean that, if they're speaking Russian, they're not, patriotic, or they don't care about Ukraine. It's not that. But if they think that we should build closer relationship with Russia in the future, and that's the solution to the situation, it is wrong, right? Because it's not going to happen, because it's just going to tie us closer to Russia. And it's not the option, right? Because this is not the choice. This is not the future. Not for us, right? We're not talking about building the future, even for me, for my generation. This is not the future that we want for our children. And I think that should be like the common basis for understanding that, yes, we want to, let's say, import some of the European values, right, which are already here in Ukraine, right? That's why I mentioned Western Ukraine, Western Ukrainian territories being part of Austrian Empire, being part of Poland. These are common sense values, right? The value of life, value of dignity, freedom of speech, things like that. And so they should be imported, they should be spread in Ukraine, they should be promoted, and we should be building on economic ties with the European Union, that's for sure. But they shouldn't become our, let me say, crutch, to forward to some kind of wonder vaccine in any case.
Okay, Natalie, so as I say, I have so many questions, but we've run out of time. So I wanted to thank you for sharing this virtual space with us. It would have been lovely to have this conversation in person. Hopefully we can do that some other time. And also to all of you who are following us through Facebook or YouTube, we would like to invite you to our channels on social media. Our Instagram is EPRI at UFM. Our Facebook is ufm.epri, and our webpage is epri.ufm.edu. I think you have most of the information in the screen, that's correct. And on the 25th of November, we'll be having Enrique Lax talking about the economic performance of 2020 and possible scenarios for 2021. And so that's all for me. Natalie, thank you so much for your time. It really has been wonderful having you on, and the best of luck.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you to the UFM, your miracle workers. Thank you to the Institute, and thank you, Will, for making sure that I'm awake and that I show up.
It must be like you're 11 or 12 already, mustn't it?
Yeah, it is past midnight right now.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. So I hope you have a good night. Okay, bye-bye. Antigua is such an amazing and special place.
An absolutely beautiful location. We're outside in nature.
Han sido 2 días en los que hemos dado un repaso a todo lo que es la Marroquín y también un repaso a todo lo que creemos que debería ser.
The Co-Creation Forum is, I think, the perfect instrument for achieving true freedom of the exchange of ideas and increasing the knowledge that we have.
Hay que estar abiertos al descubrimiento de nuevas ideas.
En Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, los estudiantes son los dueños de su proyecto académico.
Cuando uno agrega más mentes al proceso, uno sale enriquecido porque descubre métodos que no hubieras pensado por sí solo.
Ha sido una apasionante experiencia de co-creación y co-creatividad en la que personas de diferentes partes del mundo venían a crear la carrera del futuro.
67 participantes pensando en el futuro de EPRI.
It's a really interesting opportunity to engage with people in a sort of bottom-up way, to ask and try to provide some answers to important questions about education and society.
My expectations were actually superseded by reality, that the reality actually worked a lot better.
La universidad es un lugar de innovación. En cuanto deja de ser un lugar de innovación, deja de ser universidad. Por eso innovación y universidad son la misma cosa.
This event is putting Francisco Marroquín and the networks of scholars in Guatemala, students scholars, on the international map.
The future is very bright for EPRI and very bright for UFM.